Every passenger jet is a traveling life support system, carrying the highly pressurized oxygen that keeps us alive. But if it ever escapes, a simple flight becomes a living nightmare. United 811.
There was nothing in front of us or to the side of us. The whole side of the plane was gone.
Aloha 243.
Everything was being sucked out of the plane.
British Airways 5390.
I'll never forget, his face was hitting the side screen, but he didn't blink.
Mayday, mayday, mayday!
Declaring an emergency!
Sometimes it takes a terrible accident to expose hidden dangers and change the way airplanes are built.
Unfortunately, we wait until we have enough bodies. Too many of the changes have been, in effect, written in blood.
Mayday, mayday!
This is the assembly plant for the Airbus A320. After the Boeing 737, it's the most popular jet plane ever built. Almost 2,000 of them are flying for airlines around the globe. It's safe and dependable, the airline equivalent of a minivan. The aluminum skin on the top of the A320 is less than 2 millimeters thick, about as thick as a coin. This slender piece of metal helps keep passengers alive. Because the skies aren't nearly as friendly as they seem.
Most people take aviation absolutely for granted. The difference between being in a commercial airliner at 35,000 feet and being in a space capsule in orbit is really not all that different. They're both life support systems. The reality is, it's a hostile environment. The reality is, it's 50 degrees below zero outside. The reality is that jet stream or that airstream out there would kill you almost immediately.
It's not natural for people to travel through this killer atmosphere. But every day, millions of us still fly some 3,000 meters higher than the top of Mount Everest.
All our life support that's natural for us is down here at the bottom of this sea of air. And if we swim up too high, however we get there, if we're not protected, we can't live.
Taking oxygen with us up to 11,000 meters is potentially risky. The air inside an airplane is pressurized, so passengers can breathe easily. But as the plane climbs, the pressure outside decreases. The tightly packed air in the cabin exerts tremendous pressure on the fuselage. On an average jetliner, it means that every square meter of the cabin must support up to 5,500 kilograms of force, more than an African elephant. And in almost every flight, the fuselage wins the battle. But only because these protective skins developed and changed at a tragic cost.
We have concentrated in the past on changing things, but unfortunately we wait until we have enough bodies.
More than 50 years ago, a series of shocking accidents triggered changes that can still be seen today.
The Comet has blazed new trails, achieving new speeds, setting a new standard.
The passenger jet era began in the 1950s with the introduction of the de Havilland Comet. For the first time, jet engines were being used to push commercial planes higher than ever before. But in 1954, less than 2 years after its maiden flight, the glittering jewel of British aviation disintegrates in midair.
It would have been horrible, but mercifully it would have been quick. What they had found with the bodies that they had recovered is the massive decompression, of course, caused the air inside your lungs to burst your lungs. At the same time, the outrush of air would tear you from your seat and many of these people would actually smash their heads against the structure.
3 months later, another comet rips apart in flight. Officials fear that every single comet could be a flying time bomb. The entire fleet is grounded.
The design of the comet was actually a very sound design. There was only one thing that they didn't do, and it's because nobody knew.
Unknown to engineers, there's a deadly flaw in the comet's basic design. To find the jet's fatal weakness, investigators build a massive water tank. They immerse a stripped-down comet. The pressure in the tank is increased and decreased, simulating the strains of flight. The experiment runs 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. After the equivalent of some 3,000 flights, the comet's Achilles heel reveals itself. Its square windows.
You have a rapid change of direction in the shape, essentially a corner. You have a high stress concentration. It gave rise to a fatigue crack, which then traveled rapidly through the rest of the structure, causing a massive decompression.
The most advanced passenger jet in the world had succumbed to metal fatigue. The fuselage simply could not handle the force of the air inside pressing out.
The airplane, with all that force behind it, suddenly unzipped itself.
Every plane that's built today is safer because of the disaster that struck the comet. Like other passenger planes, the windows on the A320 are rounded so that pressure doesn't build up at the corners. Perhaps even more importantly, extra rivets reinforce the skin of today's planes to contain any crack that might start anywhere on the fuselage.
It's designed to go to that first row of rivets and absolutely be stopped. It's a healthy structure. It can never unzip itself.
But 34 years after the comet crashes, there was another tragic disaster. The extra rivets that were supposed to save lives failed to withstand the relentless power of air pressure on metal.
One of the fellows that I knew at the FAA, he said, you know, the day after this accident, I had to throw away most of what I knew about metallurgy and start over.
At this Airbus factory in Toulouse, France, A320s roll out at about the rate of one every working day. Titanium rivets, lightweight and extremely tough, hold the fuselage together. 3,000 are used to join the separate sections. Another 3,000 can be found on each wing. Without them, the fuselage could not contain the pressurized air inside. But even these rivets can fail to hold back the power of pressurized oxygen. April 28, 1988. Aloha Airlines Flight 243 is traveling from Hilo Airport to Honolulu. Aloha 243 is making its 9th flight of the day, a normal schedule for the planes of Aloha. Protected within the jet, these passengers give little thought to the fact that the cabin is filled with pressurized oxygen. It's constantly pushing against the fuselage, trying to escape into the surrounding atmosphere. The pressure is kept at a constant level, so passengers feel as if they've never left the ground. In fact, as a plane rises to its cruising altitude, the air pressure outside the plane is dangerously low.
Well, what we do is extract air from the engines and use that to pressurize the airplane. And what we can do then is control the pressure inside by a series of valves.
The air moving through the cabin creates constant pressure on the jet's fuselage, keeping it inflated like a balloon. Every modern jet is built to withstand this pressure.
There's an internal structure to a modern all-metal airplane. The skin without the structure would collapse easily. It would buckle easily. It'd be sort of like a paper bag without any structure inside to hold it.
If you remove the skin of a passenger jet, you'll find hoop-shaped bulkheads and formers supporting the width of the aircraft. Stringers run the length of the plane. They all help support the fuselage. And the cabin needs all the help it can get because as the plane gains altitude, that pressurized oxygen inside the plane is pushing against every square centimeter. On this day in April 1988, these passengers are about to learn what happens when that air suddenly escapes.
I saw a brilliant flash of light and boom.
Everything was being sucked out of the plane.
Aloha Airlines 243 has just suffered what experts call an explosive decompression. The air inside the plane that makes jet flight possible escapes in a sudden, horrifying moment. 35 square meters of the fuselage are gone.
Just imagine the scene up there. The top of the airplane broken off. You now have 300-mile-an-hour winds blowing into that cabin. That's 3 times hurricane-force winds. Those people were dressed for Hawaii in the springtime, not minus 50-degree temperatures. Any period of time at 24,000 feet, and those people will die.
Captain Bob Schornsteimer begins an emergency descent, dropping 20 meters a second. The stress on the damaged craft threatens to tear it apart. Against incredible odds, the flight crew land their bruised and battered airplane. Even with the explosive decompression, there's only one death on Aloha Flight 243, a flight attendant who was sucked out of the plane when the roof ripped off. Jim Wildy investigates the accident for the National Transportation Safety Board. In his laboratory, Wildy makes a disturbing discovery. He finds a series of hairline cracks. They're right beside the holes created by rivets and barely visible to the naked eye. But they're classic signs of metal fatigue.
Any piece of metal has a certain breaking point. All of us have tried to open a tin can and not quite gotten the opener all the way around it, so the can is kind of flopping. Now, what do? We work it back and forth until that last portion breaks. You just demonstrated metal fatigue.
A plane isn't a rock-solid tube. To maintain the pressure passengers need to enjoy a flight, it's designed to be much more flexible.
The fuselage of the airplane is actually breathing. It expands and contracts depending on altitude. When it's on the ground, it's in a contracted status. When it's at altitude, 24,000 feet, the fuselage expands. So the airplane is constantly cycling. That's pressurization. That will weaken the structure over a long period of time.
Records show that the Aloha jet was 19 years old. 737s are designed for a 20-year service life and a recommended 75,000 flights. But as investigators take a closer look, they discovered that the Aloha jet had logged an astonishing 89,000 separate flights. The short hops between the Hawaiian Islands meant that the planes in the Aloha fleet went through more pressurization cycles than any other aircraft. Investigator Jim Wildy gets a lead when he interviews one of the Aloha passengers. She says she saw a small crack in the fuselage just to the right of the door.
The witness saw cracking in this area, and we found fatigue cracking back in here. So this is the line where the fatigue cracking joined up. One piece came down this way and folded off, and the other piece went across the top and came off to the right side.
But something doesn't make sense. The Aloha jet lost 35 square meters of its fuselage. In the years after the Comet disaster, Boeing and other companies had designed a safety feature that should have kept any tearing to an absolute minimum. Inside the fuselage of every 737, Boeing installed tear straps. If a tear develops in the fuselage, it should only run as far as the next tear strap, never more than 10 centimeters away, before shooting off at a 90-degree angle. This would have prevented the sort of catastrophic disintegration that ripped apart the Comet. But for Aloha 243, the tear straps did not contain the rupture caused by the metal fatigue. The NTSB believes there were so many cracks in the fuselage that they eventually joined together and ran right through the tear straps. And it wasn't the only problem. The skin of an airplane is built from separate panels which overlap. These panels are bonded together by a powerful adhesive known as epoxy. As the epoxy hardens, the panels are locked together by rivets. On the Aloha fuselage, Jim Wilde finds discoloration inside some of the overlapping joints.
You can see now where the dark material is the epoxy that was used to bond the two layers of the lap joint together. The white material you see here is corrosion damage of the aluminum fuselage skin.
The Hawaiian climate is great for tourists, but tough on airplanes. The sea air is humid and heavy with salt, and it can corrode even industrial epoxy. Investigators learned that Boeing, the company that built Aloha 243, had issued numerous written warnings about the epoxy. If it isn't applied at the right temperature, if the panels have moisture or dirt on them, the bonding can fail. Boeing recommended regular detailed inspections, but at Aloha, no problems were ever found. Inspectors either never saw the compromised epoxy, or if they did, it was not repaired.
The stress that's trying to pull one skin away from the other skin piece, the stresses would go through the bonding and not through the rivets. Of course, as this thing becomes disbonded, now the rivets themselves are loaded, and especially this top row of rivets, and this is the row of rivets we think that had the fatigue cracking in it.
These cracks go unrepaired, and now you have an airplane that is a ticking time bomb.
The fuselage on Aloha 243 was seriously compromised by several factors: poor maintenance, the age of the aircraft, and by the heavy tours of duty.
Since 1988, we have come light years in understanding this, and we no longer leave ourselves the tolerance that used to be left to airlines to just go out and take a look at the airplane and sign it off.
But the Aloha flight wasn't the last time a plane was battered by depressurization. Just 2 years later, a small mistake leads to an unforgettable journey through the sky. Every day, passengers board jet aircraft around the world. It's become amazingly routine, but on every flight, a sudden loss of pressure can lead to a terrifying ordeal.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. My name is Tim Lancaster. Welcome aboard this British Airways flight to Malaga.
June 10th, 1990. British Airways Flight 5390 is leaving Birmingham, England, for Spain. 87 people are on board.
80 knots.
Two minutes into the climb, the flight crew switch on the autopilot. Captain Tim Lancaster takes off his shoulder straps. Shortly after, at 5,200 meters, the plane is very close to its assigned altitude. And then, like a cork out of a champagne bottle, the windshield bursts from its frame. Captain Tim Lancaster is sucked out of his seat and is pinned to the fuselage by blistering winds roaring close to 550 kilometers an hour. The temperature is minus 17 degrees centigrade, and there is very little oxygen. Co-pilot Alistair Atchison is alone at the controls. Ordinarily, cockpit windows can't budge from their frames. The force of the air, as the plane soars through the sky, pushes the windshield onto the plane. Flight attendant Nigel Ogden rushes in to help.
I just grabbed him before he went out completely.
Other flight attendants do what they can. co-pilot Atchison takes the plane down. He decelerates quickly, but the drop in wind pressure lets the captain slide around on the side of the plane.
His face was hitting the side of the side screen, but he didn't blink. And I thought to myself, and I said to John, I said, I think he's dead. I think he's dead.
Just 35 minutes after taking off, co-pilot Atchison gets his jet back safely on the ground. One of the most unbelievable chapters of this entire story is the fact that Captain Tim Lancaster survives his incredible ordeal.
But I remember watching the windscreen move away from the aircraft, and then it had gone like a bullet. It disappeared into the distance. And I was very conscious of going upwards. And, well, the whole thing became completely surreal then, as it would. And I was aware of being outside of the airplane. I can remember seeing the tail of the aircraft. I can remember the engines going round. And then I don't remember much more.
Tim Lancaster was pinned to the outside of the plane for over 20 minutes. His injuries were surprisingly minor. A bone fracture in his right arm and wrist, frostbite, and shock. Within 5 months, Tim Lancaster was flying again. In the immediate aftermath, investigators have very little to go on.
Windscreen was missing. There was a certain amount of blood around. There were some minor dents and scrapes on the fuselage, as you'd expect if the window had gone past. And really, that was about it, apart from a lot of paper scattered around inside.
The maintenance log is recovered from the plane. Stuart Culling learns the windscreen had been replaced just hours before takeoff.
I wanted to find out exactly what had happened to the aircraft before it took off.
Early in the investigation, the missing windscreen is found. It contains a curious piece of evidence.
There were something like 30 bolts found with it, most of which were one size short in diameter, one size too small in diameter.
On many planes, windscreens are fitted from inside the cockpit. Internal cabin pressure pushes against them, keeping them in place. But on the BAC 111, the windscreen is bolted from the outside. The pressurized oxygen inside the jet pushes out against the windscreen. The bolts must resist this pressure.
There are enough of them there that they simply can't pull out of the structure. But of course, if you then violate the very premise of that by putting the wrong bolts on, all bets are off. You're now a test pilot.
During his interview with the ground engineer who repaired the plane, Culling gets a major break.
One thing that came out was that he said, oh, the old bolts went into a waste bin in the hangar where he did the job, and they may still be there. So we rushed across to the waste bin and found something like 80 discarded bolts.
The old bolts are the proper size. Why were smaller bolts used to replace them?
And these are the ones you checked against the new ones?
That's right. Yeah, I took
from the carousel.
It was really excellent evidence. Gold, as far as I was concerned.
Instead of using the old bolts to put the new window on, the ground engineer decided to replace them. He didn't check the parts catalog to verify which bolts he needed for the job.
Morning.
The bolts he chose seemed to be the same, but in fact were just over 0.5 millimeter smaller. They were too thin to do the job. Early in the morning, working against the side of a hangar, the engineer couldn't tell the difference. Hours later, the window gave way. Faced with a challenge they weren't trained for, the crew still managed to pull their plane back from the brink. But even if a crew performs flawlessly, a sudden decompression can have deadly results, with consequences for airlines around the world. The Airbus A320, one of the most popular passenger jets in the world. Every day, thousands of passengers board this plane. When they do, they walk through what would seem to be an obvious weak spot in the fuselage: the door. Any hole in the fuselage is a potential danger, so engineers design doors that can't be opened in flight.
It is virtually impossible, I don't use that word very easily, but it is impossible for a passenger to open a plug-type door in flight.
Passenger doors are plug-type doors. They are built to be slightly larger than their frames. When a plane takes off and pressurizes, the atmosphere inside the aircraft seals the door shut.
That door probably has 10,000 or more pounds of pressure holding it firmly in place in that door frame, and you have to pull it out of that door frame to get it open.
But not all doors on an airplane are built the same. Even designs that seem flawless on paper can rip apart in the real world. February 24th, 1989, Honolulu Airport. United Airlines 811 is bound for Auckland, New Zealand.
Tell them we can handle 33 if it's available.
Okay. We did notice that there were thunderstorms 100 miles south, right on course, which was rather unusual for that time of night, so I left the seatbelt sign on.
Captain Cronin's decision to keep that sign on will save lives. As the 747 climbs past 7,000 meters, passengers sitting just above and behind the cargo door begin to hear a strange noise.
I heard like a thud.
The hell?
In the next nanosecond, it was pure, unadulterated pandemonium.
The next thing I knew, I found myself on the stairwell, hanging onto the rungs, and I immediately knew it was an explosive decompression.
Everything on the airplane that wasn't fastened down, tied down, or secured became airborne. The noise was incredible.
The 747's cargo door had torn off, ripping away a section of the fuselage. The pressurized air shot out with explosive force.
And as I looked up, that was the first time I saw this tremendous hole on the side of the aircraft that was just a void, and seats were missing, and I immediately knew that we had lost passengers.
Everything in front of us was gone. Where we were sitting, we were about 6 inches from the hole, so there was nothing in front of us or to the side of us. The whole side of the plane was gone.
Their plight is desperate, but by itself, an explosive decompression won't bring a plane down.
In 811, there's a hole as big as Tulsa in the side of this thing. I mean, it's an aerodynamic disruption of massive proportions, but if it was designed the way we had designed things a long time ago, it would have unzipped.
After the door came off, eventually a row of rivets held, keeping the plane from pulling itself apart. But the gaping hole is putting massive stress on the aircraft. The flight crew needs to descend as fast as possible. Struggling to fly their badly damaged jet, the crew turn back to Honolulu Airport.
Probably the best landing I've ever made. When we finally stopped on the runway, we deployed all 10 chutes, and the flight attendants evacuated all the passengers.
Thanks to the experienced flight crew, United Airlines 811 landed with everyone on board alive. But 9 passengers were missing, sucked out of the plane when the fuselage tore open, taking with it 5 rows of seats. One of those passengers was a New Zealander on his way home, Lee Campbell.
We got a phone call from Chicago, and they just said that they regret to inform us that our son was missing, presumed dead.
In the wake of their son's tragic death, Kevin and Susan Campbell embark on an international mission to discover exactly why the door had come off the plane.
Lee can't have died for nothing. You know, you've got to find out why he died, and you've just got to make sure that it never happens again.
2 months after the accident, the National Transportation Safety Board holds preliminary hearings. During a break, the Campbells take matters into their own hands. They remove several boxes full of files.
So we quickly realised we'd got a really good set of papers with a lot of things that hadn't been released to the public. We were able to really start our investigation in earnest at that stage.
The unpublished documents reveal a disturbing catalogue of problems with the 747's forward cargo door, going right back to its original design. Passenger doors open inwards, but most cargo doors on jets open outward. This increases the space for luggage and other cargo. As the plane gains altitude, the pressure inside the jet presses outwards against the door. To prevent the door from opening, Boeing had installed what it believed was a foolproof locking system.
What they do is they build in multiple redundancies to make sure the door is properly latched and does not open. And you build it in to a point of that it's extremely improbable that the door would ever open.
The Campbells' research uncovers 2 major flaws with the 747 cargo doors. The first involved the locking system. To lock the cargo doors, electric motors turn C-shaped latches around pins in the door frame. A handle then moves arms or locking sectors over the top of the C-latches to prevent them from reopening. But on Flight 811, the supposedly foolproof system had failed. Kevin Campbell built a model of the 747 cargo door latch. It showed the first deadly flaw in the locking system. Aluminum locking sectors could not hold the C-latch in place if the latches started to open on their own.
With the aluminium locking sectors, if the C-locks tried to backwind, open electrically, it would just push the locking sector out of the way. It just simply wasn't up to the job that it was designed for.
But the Campbells aren't finished. They continue digging for answers. What they uncover will force Boeing to change how it builds airplanes. Kevin and Susan Campbell are trying to discover why a 747's cargo door tore off in flight, killing their son, Lee. During their research, they learned that 2 years before Flight 811, a Pan Am 747 out of Heathrow had its own pressurization problems.
When they got back to Heathrow, they found that the door was hanging open 1.5 inches at the bottom, and all of the locks were open. When it got to the maintenance base, they found that all of the locking sectors were either bent or broken.
The passengers on this flight were lucky. They had survived the faulty locking system. But why had the C-latches turned and bent the locking sectors? As the Campbells continue to search, a Pan Am report surfaces that lays out a critical issue with the cargo door's electrical system. When the cargo door's outer handle is placed in the closed position, a master lock switch should disconnect the power supply. This would stop the C-latches from turning. But something was wrong with the switch.
There was power to the door locks with the outer handle closed, and the lock started to move, and it started to force the locking sectors out of the way.
The faulty power switch and weak locking sectors were no match for the pressurized oxygen inside the plane. After 2 years of being pushed by the Campbells, the NTSB produces a report that agrees.
There was an inadvertent failure of either the switch or the wiring that caused an uncommanded opening of the door.
It's nice that other people know that you're right and had been all along, and the support that they had given you was vindicated.
I couldn't have lived with myself if we had done no investigating ourselves. It was just something we both felt we needed to do. We didn't even discuss it. We just knew that's what we would do.
After United Flight 811, the locking systems on the Boeing 747 cargo doors were changed. Inspections were increased. Another potential source of explosive decompression had been found and eliminated.
That is an amazing accolade to what we've learned, not just Boeing, but what we've learned about maintenance, about structures, maintaining them, and inspecting them.
Since the first pilot soared to record heights, the aviation industry has struggled to harness and contain the deadly power of pressurized oxygen. They know all too well that a single flaw can lead to a terrifying decompression. But more than 15 years after United 811, another deadly lesson is learned.
Do you read over?
It's August 14th, 2005. For almost an hour, Helios Flight 522 has been circling the skies over Athens.
Helios 522, over.
Its flight crew has stopped communicating with the air traffic control. Fearing a terrorist attack, the Greek Air Force scrambles 2 fighter jets to circle the mystery plane.
There is no structural failure, there is no fire, there is no problem, obvious problem from the external view with the plane.
Someone in the cockpit waves at the fighter pilot, but all too soon, the jet loses altitude and falls towards the ground. All 121 people on board are killed. It is the worst air crash in the history of Greece. The autopsies add more mystery to the case. Everyone on board the Helios flight was alive up to the moment of the crash. But if passengers were alive until impact, why didn't the fighter pilot see more activity on the plane? Akrivos Soulakis is the lead investigator. He begins to dig through maintenance records. He learns that on the day of the crash, the rear door had been inspected for leaks. Before it took off on its last flight, the Helios jet arrived in Cyprus with a problem. During the trip, the cabin crew had heard loud banging and saw ice on a rear service door. To make sure there is nothing wrong with the seal on the door, the engineer runs a pressurization test. He's looking for a leak.
So explain again how you tested the pressure.
When I went into the cockpit, I turned the pressurization switch to manual, switching digital pressure control unit from auto to manual.
The jet's engines are turned off, so the engineer uses the plane's auxiliary power unit to force air into the cabin.
It's like looking for a leak in a tire. In this case, what you're having to do is pressurize the aircraft, use a barometer essentially to monitor the pressure inside and look for leaks that way.
After completing the pressurization test, the ground engineer reports that the jet is in good working order. But the digital pressure control is left in the manual position.
They were supposed to return the selector to the auto position.
If the flight crew fails to see that the switch is on manual, their plane won't properly pressurize. The oxygen available inside the plane will be just as thin as the outside atmosphere. The passengers will be directly exposed to a deadly environment in which they cannot survive. August 14th, 2005. The worst airline disaster in Greek history has stunned the nation. Investigators are sifting through the gruesome wreckage. A few minutes after 9 in the morning, Helios Flight 522 left from Cyprus, bound for Athens. The crew has no idea that hours before takeoff, during a maintenance test, a flight engineer has left a pressurization switch set to manual. Both the captain and co-pilot miss the fact that the plane is not set to pressurize automatically. As Helios 522 climbs, an alarm blares in the cockpit.
What is it? The takeoff config warning?
It's a non-pressurization warning, but it sounds identical to another alarm. The pilots confuse the two. It's a critical mistake.
Operations, this is Flight 522, over.
Flight 522, what can I do for you?
We have a takeoff config warning on.
Sorry, can you repeat?
As pilots troubleshoot with ground engineers, life-sustaining oxygen is slowly seeping out of the plane. Eventually, oxygen masks drop in the cabin. They do not fall in the cockpit.
The reason that we don't have automatically deploying oxygen masks in a cockpit is simply too much up there, and if you had things popping out, they're going to hit switches that they shouldn't hit.
Confused by the alarm and therefore not taking proper precautions, both the captain and the co-pilot collapse unconscious. The oxygen is too thin to breathe.
We're the ones that should be trained consistently to understand that ears popping, anything that indicates pressurization, you don't even talk to each other before you grab that mask and put it on.
The passengers are unaware that the plane is now flying itself. In emergency situations, chemical generators above the seats pump out oxygen, but there is a catch. These generators only produce enough oxygen for 12 minutes.
Well, the problem with the passenger masks is, for one thing, they're not designed to keep you oxygenated at a high altitude. What they're designed to do is give you enough oxygen so that you can survive until the pilots get the airplane down to a low altitude.
But with both pilots already unconscious, this plane never reached the lower altitude where passengers could breathe without support. Instead, the plane flew on autopilot to Athens. When the oxygen supply stopped, the passengers collapsed. By the time the Greek Air Force intercepts the Helios jet, it appears as though only one person is still conscious, likely surviving with bottled oxygen. Flight attendant Andreas Prodromo is still conscious when the fighters approach. He has made it to the cockpit, but he can't save the plane.
Athens Control, there is one person moving in the cockpit of Helios 522.
Eventually, when its fuel runs out, Helios 522 crashes north of Athens. In the wreckage, investigators find the panel with the pressurization switch.
Are you sure this is the way it was found? It hasn't been moved at all.
All 121 people on the Helios flight died because their plane didn't carry enough life-sustaining oxygen as it climbed into the sky. It has been more than 50 years since the beginning of the passenger jet era. 50 years in which the industry has learned, sometimes painfully, how to safely fly more than 10 kilometers in the sky.
When you look back at all the other accidents over the last 20 years, in most cases, we were pushing the frontier of knowledge.
In search of the safest plane possible, the history of aviation traces a flight path through tragic accidents to technological breakthroughs. Many of these accidents display the power of explosive decompression. The Airbus A320 and every other passenger plane built today is infinitely safer than the first jets that flew in the 1950s. Tragic crashes and amazing escapes have made each aircraft better able to handle the brutal conditions we fly through so easily.